Hi everyone, this is Britjet's PSX Tips, the Aerowinks PSX Boeing 747-400 desktop simulation. Today I'm going to be talking about suitability of runways for landing. This video is for anyone using PSX, but there are aspects of using a scenery generator which will add considerable interest and give you the opportunity to try some airfields which you wouldn't normally fly a 747 into. Not all are suitable, of course, like this one. However, some will be a real challenge. Within your normal database of airfields, you will still find some short runways, and calculations for these would be appropriate. But even at long runways, professional pilots will make calculations of, for example, how much landing distance they're going to use to find out which runway turnoff they're going to be expecting. Runway suitability then, is it strong enough, wide enough, long enough? And also a lot of other real-world considerations. This is not an exhaustive list, but might give you some idea. So let's go on and have a look, first of all, at runway strength. Most significant airports these days will have a PCN, pavement classification number, like the examples below, and they'll be found in the airport information section. Breaking it down, we have the PCN number on the left. Rigid or flexible means basically whether it's concrete or asphalt, then subgrade strength, then tire pressure limit, and the way it is actually measured. Aircraft will have an ACN, an aircraft classification number. Two examples here, the 747 at the top and a CL215 at the bottom, and you'll see that the numbers are much smaller for the lighter aircraft. If we look at the 747 in more detail, you'll see that the tables are divided into flexible and rigid pavement, and then the subgrades between A, B, C and D. And then below that, the actual PCN numbers for a maximum weight and a minimum weight, and you can extrapolate between them and form a table like this one, which comes out of an aircraft manual. So for a particular pavement subgrade, you can find for a particular weight a PCN number that would be acceptable. So what you do then is you go into your airport information and you find out what your PCN is for the airfield, like this one here, which is 46 FBXT. It's a flexible pavement, subgrade strength B, so we would be in this table, this column here, and we see that the limit is 46, which actually ties in nicely with a maximum weight here of 300 tons. So we can land at our maximum of 285.7, and we can actually take off with a limit of 300 tons. And the tire pressure code of X is okay for a 747. Runway width then, well, the minimum recommended width for landing is 45 meters. You can't turn round on that. Incidentally, the minimum turning width is just over 46, and actually 60 meters recommended. Boeing will approve certain landings in 40-meter runways, and in fact it's possible to do them down to 30 meters, as some of you will know for real world. There are a lot of airfields hanging about in the database which are actually 30 meters or so, plenty in South America I've noticed, and Central America. So if you want to try these with a scenery generator, then this might be an issue, but underneath is what a 30-meter runway will look like for the 747, and you can see that although you haven't got a lot of room, it is doable. It's worth mentioning that if you land on a runway like this, taking off is a similar issue. You don't want to be going off sideways, so crosswinds and engine failures would have to be considered. And for example, you'd probably use a fixed D rate of probably TO2 to ensure that you had control of the aeroplane if an engine failed on takeoff, but that's another issue. So the minimum width then 45 meters, but for sim purposes I think you can go down to 30. A check on the runway length has two stages of legal calculations. The planning stage would normally be done by a company with computerized calculations and take worst case weight and wind situations to ensure that the expected runway was going to be suitable. Once in flight, the pilot still has to check it's legal to use the runway if there's any doubt using the current conditions, and he'll do that with charts on board. Once he's made sure he's legal, you can then use advisory information after that to reduce your braking, possibly to give you optimal braking requirements. And the reason you can reduce is because the planning stage and the legal calculations have huge margins built into them. I'm just putting up a slide here about the ISA, the International Standard Atmosphere, for anybody who's not familiar with it. Feel free to freeze the frame and have a look if you feel you need more information. The planning stage calculations will be something like the flow diagram that's here. You can see there's a lot of factors being taken into account. I'm not going to deal with them on this slide. But in flight, the generalized charts might be used, and of course you need a general to work them out. But actually they're not too bad, so you can work them like most charts, backwards or forwards. So for example, here you have the field length available. Go in with whatever your runway length is, work your way through the chart for the various local situations and come out with a landing weight. Or you can work it backwards from the landing weight back down and find out how much runway you're actually going to need. Now, I talked about these various landing distances and I talked about the margins. What are the margins and how do we arrive at these landing distances? Well, this is Randy. Randy has got perfect teeth. In every way, he's a perfect pilot. He's a very, very good handler of the aircraft, and because of that, of course, he is a Boeing test pilot. Now, Randy takes the 747 up and he lands the aircraft time after time to see how much distance he's actually going to use. And he comes in like this and he arrives on his runway and he uses maximum braking like we have here and stops about here. Now, for most countries, you will then be allowed a huge extra margin of 67% if it's a dry runway, or it actually works out at 92% for a wet runway. And most airlines will have wet runway calculations built in. So you can see the margins are huge. Now, instead of using a generalized chart with a very sharp pencil, a lot of airlines will produce a table, something like this. It would take quite a while to explain it in detail. Lots of charts are different, but basically you can find the maximum tailwind permitted at a particular weight, or if the runway is short, you'll be able to find out the maximum weight permitted with the current weight. And there are things in here such as auto land differences and what to do if you've got some brakes deactivated as well. But these tables are using the generalized figures, so they are actually very pessimistic. Once you've checked your legal, you can use the advisory tables to see what would be the optimal braking to use. There are loads of pages. This is one, and the pages are for different flap settings and braking action, and indeed for non-normal configurations. On the right here, you'll see there are various types of braking action listed. I'm only going to talk about dry runways and a mention of wet runways. Anything else would be contaminated. But on that subject, a wet runway is one with a depth of less than 3 millimeters of water, but with good braking action. So the one above definitely wouldn't qualify. Anything worse than that, 3 millimeters and good, you would have to treat as contaminated. This is the section you'll use most of the time for a shortish runway, flat 30 dry runway, and you will see that there's a whole number of figures here. In this case, it's based on 290 tons, just above the maximum landing weight, and there are a number of caveats to this. Maximum reverse thrust, the aircraft landing 460 meters from the threshold, and an extra margin of 15% added. So if we look at our max landing weight of 290 tons, max manual braking brings us out using 1520 meters. Now you take your 460 off it and you take off your 15%, and you've actually got a distance on the runway of less than 1,000 meters at max landing weight. And then there are weight corrections, sea level corrections, wind, and so on. So I think you can see that quite quickly we can realize that the landing distance actually on the concrete of the 747 can in many cases be well less than 1,000 meters. A couple of things I'll mention here. The wind adjustment here, as you can see, tailwind adjustments are quite huge. The reason for that is that at the planning stage, you're only allowed to take into account 50% of a headwind, but you have to use 150% of the tailwind. So that's why there's quite a big difference between those values. And then over here on the reverse thrust section, you will see there is a section for using 2 or no reversers, which looks a bit confusing. But basically what they're saying is if you have an engine failed, they assume you're going to use symmetrical reversers. So in other words, only 2 reversers. And if you had an engine with an unserviceable reverser before you started off, then if the opposite engine failed as well, you might finish up with no reversers. So that's why we've got the 2 reversers and no reversers in there. So basically you go into your table, you make calculations according to the various changes that you've got, and you will come out with a distance. Now you'll notice incidentally that the auto brake figures here don't have until later on very much in the way of reverse thrust adjustment. The reason for this is that the auto brakes are doing a perfectly good job, and the reverse thrust is merely reducing the brake energy being absorbed by the brakes as they do their deceleration rate, which they've been programmed to. As the aircraft starts to use auto brakes 2 and 1, then the effect of reversers becomes more noticeable, because the reversers actually do start to enhance what the auto brakes are already doing. So this is the table you would use for advisory information to give you an idea how much runway you're actually going to use, and indeed what turnoff you would expect to make. So here's me doing my Randy impression. I'm coming in at VREF, flap 30, and I'm going to put it down right on the piano keys like this. Down, max manual braking, full reverse. Let's see how much runway we actually use. And coming to a complete stop now. And you can see where we finished up on the runway here in the diagram. The distance used was 650 meters, and if you do all the factors in the table, we should have had about 680 meters. So I'm pretty pleased with that, and I think Randy would be too. Here we go again, this time at 285 tons, and I'm trying to land in the normal place about 460 meters down the runway, which is spot on. And then using full reverse again, and this time seeing how much runway we use again. And you'll see the weight makes quite a considerable difference. Nevertheless, we've stopped well before the end, like that. So on this test landing, I actually used 1500 meters, which used up a bit of my margin, but I think you can see that it's very, very close to the actual tabulated figures. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. It's been useful to you, obviously for PC use only, but it will broaden your horizons, particularly if you're using a scenery generator, enable you to try some airfields that maybe you wouldn't think of trying normally. The world's your oyster out there, so enjoy it, and see you again soon. Thanks for watching.